Welcome to the 8th episode of the Animal Riot Podcast, brought to you by Animal Riot Press, a literary press for books that matter. It's your producer, Katie, here, and this episode has been edited to reflect our new name. If you're new to the Animal Riot community, welcome, and you can find out more about us at animalriotpress.com. Now on to the episode, with today's guests, Caits Meissner and Sergio De La Pava.
We're here again today with Caits Meissner, the generous and thoughtful director of PEN America's prison writing program, and also with Sergio De La Pava, the best maximalist writer alive, if you're asking this nice young Jewish boy. So how about we do some quick I'll do the challenge first. We have a huge spread of cheese and bread and hummus. It's very Mediterranean, actually, and lox, and Caits has to eat all of it. Okay, now introduce yourself, Caits.
I'm Caits. I'm gluten-free, so I will not be eating all of it, so I automatically lose the challenge.
Okay. Turn it off.
I am a writer, poet, illustrator, program director of the Prison and Justice Writing Program at PEN America. That's a mouthful. And I'm glad to be hanging with you guys again.
We'll superimpose it on the last time you introduced yourself, and I'm sure it'll be the exact same.
Yeah.
Like the cadence is perfect.
Yeah. I'm sure.
Yeah,
it's like your elevator pitch, you know?
Uh-huh.
An elevator pitch for a human being.
That's the world we live in, Sergio.
I
What's
don't
your
know
brand?
what to say other than glad to be here. Let's talk whatever you want to talk about. I'm a public defender and a writer.
Beautiful.
We need to get you branded.
That does not live in Brooklyn.
Right.
That's the most important part.
And when, this is purely audio, right? So there's about 3 pounds of food, and Kate said, this isn't a challenge at all. This is like a typical afternoon for me.
Especially that one block of cheese, because last time I was here, I think I finished it.
All right, cool. While you're engaging in the challenge, just start talking about some things. Let's start with how you guys met.
Sure. We met because I reached out to Sergio, really, and said, we're doing all this work around prison and justice and writing. Well, we've been doing it for a long time, but now I'm here doing it. And I would love for you to come and stand in for a writer in prison who won an award with us this year and read an excerpt of his fiction piece. And Sergio said, sure, I'd love to. And then he came and it was fantastic. And then we got one of the best letters of my entire life, let's just be honest, from the writer Peter Dunn, who was just really astonished and felt very validated, which made me feel great by the way that his work appeared in the world. And
this was the incarcerated writer, right?
Right,
yeah.
And he's an excellent writer, so it was really felt great. It was a wonderful letter, huh?
I mean, it was a remarkable letter. I mean, of course, I messed up. I was going to bring it and read from it.
Oh, I have it.
Yeah,
we could totally do
get it
that.
out.
Oh, yeah,
right.
we should do
But
that.
while you're doing that, I'll say that you're underselling this event a little bit because it was truly spectacular. It was in Brooklyn, and there was a live performance of a play, maybe.
Yes.
There was tremendous music. There was a lot of reading of poetry, and the piece that I read kind of centered around I'm going to call it a CO-sanctioned assault in a prison.
Whoa.
Yeah, which is unfortunately a common thing, at least in
Totally fiction, or was it?
It was being labeled as fiction.
Yeah,
certainly.
Yeah.
It was powerful. It was moving, and I just thought the entire event was really spectacular. I had a lot of colleagues of mine from the public defender world who you would not think would have been moved by this event as much as the average person, because we've kind of lived this world of interacting with incarcerated people and trying to find some way to make them not be incarcerated or to reduce the amount of time they've been incarcerated. But they all uniformly said to me that this gave them a different perspective on our work, right?
Wow.
So I just I did that night, but I commend you again for just a brilliant event. And anything like that in the future, I'm down.
Thank you.
Without doubt.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's really encouraging to hear, especially to hear about your colleagues as well. And Sergio also, just to give him more props, then came very shortly after and spoke with our Writing for Justice fellows. We had a writer's lunch with folks that were writing, journalists, novelists, one novelist, Sergio, et cetera, who came in and hung out with some of our folks who are embarking on their projects and had some informal dialogue and conversation. And I put Sergio on to dig in. He'd never had it and he loved it. I recall.
I was about to ask you what that was again,
Dig in.
because
Two ends.
dig in. All right,
I have
free
the
commercial
letter.
for digging.
I have the letter from Peter
Yeah.
if you want to read from it.
I do.
All right.
So I
Take
guess
it back.
you guys, meaning Penn, sent them what exactly, the
We
bound
send-
anthology?
So we did for the first time ever a print anthology from the Prison Writing Awards. These awards have been going on for 30 years. First annual. It's a really beautiful book, drawn by Molly Crabapple, blurbs from Piper Kerman, Kisei Lehman, whose name I never get right, so sorry about that, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm really proud of the book. And we sent the book to every winner, obviously, whose work appeared in it, but we also sent photographs from the night with nice printouts specifically of their piece being read with their name and the piece projected behind the reader. So Peter got a lot of Sergio, as well as photos from the other events. We sent images of the slides. We sent feedback that people had written to us about the event. We compiled it into that package, and of course I read a letter introducing it all. So it's a package of ephemera from the evening that they couldn't participate in, where they
That's
see
what I was
their
gonna
work come
ask.
alive.
I mean, just
Yeah.
because I can imagine if that was me, I would be like, my perspective on even it's funny because Sergio talks about this in his book about like the difference between the physical and metaphysical barriers that keep you incarcerated,
Sure.
And just having that media and being able to see that would completely change my perspective on my entire life. I mean, because of the fact that I'm sitting in this cell or whatever,
Well, I
mean,
think this is exactly what Peter speaks to.
just
Which is great.
the futility I feel when I'm trying to get stuff published as like a, quote unquote difficult writer, which obviously Sergio's dealt with too. I mean, it's just that this is like it's an exponent of that. It's just it's amazing. But anyways,
I do want to read from the letter. I'm not going to read the entire letter. It's
Sure.
a little long, but
Yeah.
this is what he says about receiving the package that you sent him, Caits. The rest is a quote. I finally understood what it means to cry tears of joy. I literally stared at everything for hours, as if afraid that blinking would cause it to vanish. I mean, this guy's like an artist. You can just hear that in that, right? The next morning, I bolted awake, emptied the contents of the envelope on my bed, and exhaled, relieved that it wasn't a dream. Thank you, and Penn. We need more people like you in society, those who are brave and selfless and committed enough to fight for the changes this world desperately needs. I'm honored that you were moved enough by my story to include it in the project. Everything looks so perfect. Really, I hope those who attended or live streamed the event came away thinking, prisoners are people too. They have families and friends, hopes and dreams. They are not the monsters I once thought they were. Some of them are good people who made bad decisions when they were younger. I mean, it goes on, but receiving a letter like that, and then he says, to my dismay, I have a few questions about the event. Did you choose Sergio De La Pava to read my work, or did he? And if so, why? Also, what did he say about it? I'm going to read his book, and it goes on in that direction.
I like how he said they're not the monsters I once thought they were. That it's like he has that. It's almost that self-conscious awareness where he's kind of removed from his own body and
I think
looking at himself.
It seems like a natural human inclination to want to judge others harshly, and probably nobody feels that more than incarcerated people.
Oh yeah,
Sure.
I mean, I
Would
think
be my
about that
guess.
every day.
But the funny part is that I've interacted with incarcerated people probably much more, more often than the average person. The people doing the incarcerating, like most directly, like corrections officers and stuff, are the ones that least feel that way. They most see how permeable the barrier is between somebody being incarcerated or not, and probably the least judgy, to use a made-up word, towards that community than ever. But I have noted, it could just be wanting this to be true, maybe, but I have noticed a pretty significant change in society's view towards incarceration, incarcerated people, mass incarceration, whatever you want to call it, from the time that I started working in this area more than 20 years ago. At that time, there was like 4 of us doing this work. Me and my wife were 50% of them, and nobody could understand why you would do it.
Right.
And I think that a lot of that has melted away.
Yeah, we had a Democrat who started the kind of like prison industrial complex. I mean, that just shows how much has changed since then. I mean, I can't imagine a liberal standing up there and saying we need more prisons and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean,
at this point,
it's. I mean, the best word to use is probably an awakening in the last
Yeah.
6 years, maybe 5 years. to what had been going on and the importance of finding a way to stem the tide.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for reading that letter from Peter. Peter Dunn is his name. He has other work published online as well, if you're interested in looking it up. I hear you read that. I've read that letter many times. It really moved me, and I still get choked up hearing it. Just a fun note to share with you all is that I just, maybe last week, got another letter from Peter that included a line or two of feedback to many of the other writers in the anthology, asking us to send it to them, which also made me feel really great.
Yeah, I was going to ask for an update. And what's his situation? Like, are we able to talk about that right now? How much more time does he have? Blah blah blah.
I think he says in the letter. I can't remember exactly. I think it's at least 7 years. I'm not positive about that. He's at Eastern Correctional. You can write to him. You can look up anybody in prison and write to them.
Sure. Peter Dunn.
Mm-hmm. And this year, for our World Voices Festival event in our program, we commissioned writers, actually, that we work with that have won awards or that we know are great writers to write new pieces on the topic of writing in prison under the public versus private dialogue or conversation. We had a series of prompts, and Peter wrote something really great, so I'm sure we'll see his work on stage in May as well.
Yeah, I gotta check him out. I'm gonna take a little tangent right here. I got a question for both of you guys, because you obviously have so much experience in this entire, justice complex that we have. Because things have changed so rapidly, as you said, Sergio, in the last 20 years or so. Are we getting to a point where we're moving towards a post-judgment society, where we're realizing that there's obviously a better way to rehabilitate people, and the punishment?
That sounds probably a little too optimistic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'll refer you back to my comment about just the pleasure that human beings derive from judging others harshly. It's going to be hard to overcome that. There are people who are abolitionists when it comes to prison. Mm-hmm. I could probably be convinced to join them, but I think the reality is more not as sweeping a change as that, and more just a recognition that there are other options other than incarceration that make a hell of a lot more sense, especially when you're talking about nonviolent offenders whose often conduct is motivated by addiction issues or mental health issues.
Those are my passion projects. I was a psych major in college, and I thought about being a psychiatrist or a psychologist, what have you, clinician of some sort. And addiction is probably, Caits and I spent half an hour talking about this last week. I went to research labs. I did all this stuff. I'm obsessed with the subject. I think I borderline think that drugs should be legal, just straight up. I think it's ridiculous, and I could talk about that at length, but I kind of want to get your perspective. You deal with, people who come in, and there's a whole range of issues that brings you to that point, right? So what is your opinion on drugs in general?
All right. How much time do you have?
I wanted a more specific question,
it may just be my opinion, but I think that most people, majority of people, addicted to something, maybe a substance, maybe something else.
I agree. Mm-hmm. If I stopped drinking coffee, I would pick something else up, or if I stopped smoking weed, I would just do something else that I fixate on. I totally believe that,
I think existence or life is probably really difficult, and one of the things that I would marshal as evidence towards that is the average human being's need to kind of engage in a compulsive activity to deal with that fact. Most of the people that I meet that have become addicted to narcotics, let's say, the addiction is more the symptom of something else that's underlying their lives rather than the thing that's caused, and then that in itself causes a whole bunch of other problems, like involvement in the criminal justice system.
Well, especially because once it's illegal, then you have to be violent in order to protect that business.
There's also just a large incidence of mental health issues, untreated mental health issues that contribute to all these things. And if you view addiction as kind of in that sphere, it kind of all starts to make a lot more sense. But a really large percentage of the law firm, the public defender office that I work at's clients have some form of mental health issue that they could benefit from some kind of targeted assistance with. Whether you include drug addiction as part of that, or just say that that's a reason that leads to drug addiction often. I'm not a clinician. I also studied psychology as an undergrad and considered that, but I didn't go in that direction. But so a lot of this is just anecdotal of 20 years of meeting people who have found themselves in the criminal justice system.
But honestly, that's a way more broad and informed perspective than I think 99.9% of the public has on drug use and addiction.
Yeah, and I mean, I
think it's extremely binary. I mean, you have for example, you have our attorney general come up and say, if you smoke weed, you're a bad person. It's just incredibly primitive, I think. But one thing I want to ask you guys, so if you think you're going to replace any drug with compulsion, like we all do, what are your guys' compulsions?
Worrying,
yeah. That's like axiomatic.
Oh, worrying.
Anxiety.
You're not even sublimating it. You're just like...
I'm just spinning, ruminating.
That's the epitome of maturity right there.
You think worry?
I think the phone is also very, very addictive.
Yeah.
And social media is very, very addictive, and I try not to fall into that trap, but sometimes I'll find myself like, whoa, I just wasted a half hour doing nothing.
Uh-huh.
And I think that there's a hit that comes, obviously. Oh, I got a new message. Oh, I got a new like. That's been, people have been talking about this, so I'm not making this up. Mm-hmm. But yet, we still use them. I don't know. I think that there's something that's...
But I'm interested in worrying. You don't think that worrying gives you pleasure, do you? Or maybe you do. I'm not trying to kind of...
Or resolve something else. I've kind of always thought that it was a closed system of like chasing like compulsions and obsessions, and it's
I view compulsions as trying to turn something else off or trying to overshadow something else.
Right.
That's the way I view it.
No,
that's like obsession.
It's really, you sink into the opposite. You sink into the anxiety. A drug takes away the anxiity. So I
would think the anxiety is the thing that I would engage in a compulsion to avoid.
Right. That's true.
By if my compulsion were playing golf, which is an expensive compulsion, something like that, I don't play golf.
That's the last thing I would have thought I heard. I would hear from your mouth.
Right, I don't play golf. I'm just picking an example of something because then I would be engaging in that because I need to shut down the voice that's always anxious.
Right, that's true.
So, for example, as we were talking earlier, marijuana use is very widespread in the teen population that my office deals with, teens involved in the criminal justice system. And I've observed, again, not statistically significant, just an observation, that a lot of them have issues that I think causes them to turn marijuana use from something that could be recreational or somehow be enjoyable into a compulsion, into an everyday compulsion. Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. I mean, medicine is stretch or self-medicating, essentially.
Right. And we think we see that with what's the opiates? Mm-hmm. With the opiate is that it's something that you're driven to do, I think, often as a means of ignoring or sublimating something else.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So
and I feel that way about writing. For myself, that when I am writing fiction, it's an attempt to deal with an anxiety, a deep-seated anxiety that I have about not being able to control the world that I live in. Mm.
That makes sense.
So, I mean, writing fiction is a great way to control how certain things are going to happen to invented people or invented world. And
that's the exact same thought I've had.
Right. Sometimes I've thought
you get to play
my
God.
Compulsion to do that is an attempt to deal with a psychological fissure that I have that makes me inordinately upset about the fact that the world is about a loss of control.
Mm-hmm. Mm. That makes sense. I wish writing was more of a compulsion for me. I would do more of it.
I wish writing. I wish I did more writing, I guess.
Do you write every day?
No.
Your books are enormous. You must do a ton of writing.
If you break it down, the amount of pages I've published, how long I've been writing, it's not. You know what I mean?
Well, that's because you probably write clean sentences. If you're like me, then you write about 2 million words for one book. That's like 100,000 words.
That's true that I don't write 500 pages and then publish 100. I write 120 and publish 100, 110 and write something.
That's the difference between me and you.
So
talent.
But the difference is, I don't know what motivates fiction writing. I can kind of pretend that something motivates it now, but it would be something different than what motivated it when I first started doing it. Because certainly nobody gets paid to be a fiction. Unlike most jobs, you don't get paid to be a fiction writer as you're first writing fiction. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Nobody says you're hired to be a writer, a novelist. Now, a year from now, we're going to want that novel that we've been paying for.
Oh, that should be, I mean,
Right.
that should be day one lesson in creative writing when you're a sophomore,
So in some respect, anybody who wrote a first novel just wrote it, right? They weren't being paid to do it. I mean, you'll have exceptions if somebody was famous beforehand and they somehow wrote a novel, which happens occasionally. But when you think back to writing that first novel or that first collection of poetry or that first collection of short stories, whatever it is, you were essentially doing it on spec. So the motivation couldn't have been the usual work like obligation. The reason you go to an office, for example, put on a suit, and you do that because you're getting paid to do it contemporaneously. When you create art, often there must be something else that's driving you to do it that is not economic obligation.
Well, I think that's right. And actually, I think that idea of it being a relieving factor or some kind of mechanism to take you either out of pain or something redirecting pain, or maybe not pain or lack of control, this or that. I mean, certainly when I was a child, that was the case of feeling really, I've been making art and writing as an identity since I was very, very young, 5. I had that language, luckily, from my
So you didn't have a contract?
parents. No, I didn't. I wasn't a child star of art, but
We're still waiting on the manuscript.
It's. But I think that as a child, it was very clear. It's very clear looking back that I was bullied a lot. I was more comfortable with the adults. My poor Caits sob story, but really, that's what it was going into creating my own world.
Yeah,
and making books and
that's
making
almost
art.
like a getaway. Like that's more of a
I think
pure
it's many,
escape. Well,
many young people who create. It starts at a very early age for some folks as well and I don't think about it in the same terms as an adult, but it must be. There must be a comfort there for me too that has been there for
Definitely.
a very long time.
Well, it might have merged with some of what Sergio was saying, but basically what happened with me is I was a 3-sport big time athlete when I was a kid,
Really?
But when I was a teenager, when I started playing for my high school teams, I started getting panic attacks before my basketball games and stuff like that. And that loss of control, that's the first thing that kind of drove me to make art, was because I could create my own world while figuring out why things were happening to me and why things were happening in the world. So yeah, I can really relate to that. I also think the other half of it for me is that escape, just not having to deal with the anxiety and the pressure of, for better or worse, capitalism, essentially, especially at this point. It's tough out there.
I would think most artists would have a similar answer. That'd be my guess. That art, although many people can also be heavy drug users and artists, so it doesn't necessarily replace that, but there's something in the creative process, obviously, that we know is satisfying, at most extreme, maybe healing, guiding, directing, can be torturing, I'm sure. It is sometimes. All those things. But I don't know. To your original question, I am not necessarily somebody who... I've never been addicted to drugs, so it's hard for me to imagine what I would replace that with, because it seems to have such an intense grip on folks when it's happening. I guess I used to smoke cigarettes, so that's the closest I could come to understanding that addiction. But then I got off cigarettes with another drug, which was Wellbutrin, which they prescribe under another name to help quit smoking. So
yeah, no, that's a pattern that's often prescribed to stop smoking. But I think you bring up a really good point, because you're immediately coming out and saying, I have no experience with this personally, so I don't know what it's like. And to me, it's very ironic that we have public figures and leaders that make legislation and policy that don't have experience with this, don't research this. They have little birds in their ear, the experts, quote unquote. But I don't understand why people that have no experience with this and haven't studied this are in control of the policy. And for example, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but there's we discussed this on the first time, the first part of the series. There's an herb called kratom that we were drinking together. And it's legal right now. It's an Indonesian plant that has a very, very small amount of an opioid property in it, but the rest is it's a full battery of neurotransmitters that it affects. It's really everything. It's an herbal antidepressant, really. It's pretty amazing. And the FDA, of course, is trying to ban it now. And of course, their line is the same one that it was with weed. It's like, oh, well, we got to research it, but you can't research it unless it's legal, and then around you go, And so they're just going to probably ban it outright. But as soon as that happens, you're going to see another 1 to 2 million former opioid addicts right back out on the street. It's going to happen like that,
Yeah, I think that's a problem across the board.
I don't understand.
Well, most
policy.
Most people making policies about things are not directly experienced in that world. And I actually have come to think over the last 2 years probably is to have a lot of hope around the act of empathy. And I've gotten more cynical in my older age, but I think that empathy is a lot harder for humans than we think it is. I think there's an intellectual part of us that can understand other people's experiences that are different than our own through observation. I think that we can be moved by people's experiences through things we see. But I actually think that really trying to understand somebody else's experience, especially if it's vastly different from your own, is actually quite hard for humans to make that leap.
Well, and technically,
distance.
empathy, isn't it actually? It's like vicariously experiencing, not just intellectually, like figuring your way into someone's shoes. It's like, I feel like that's like the pure form of empathy. I don't know. Now I'm just like dealing in semantics, but
I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not sure what it is or isn't, but I think
because that intellectual exercise can be fun and it can be very revealing in its own way, but to actually have that kind of like almost like phantom, that phantom sense.
Right.
It's much more rare.
I think that's where people rely, obviously, on books and movies. But I do think about, like, if somebody's grown up in a part of the world or even country that you've never seen or never been to, a difficulty, and even I've seen liberal people who tout empathy. I'm sure I've done this myself many a time, who just can't seem to understand that people see through different perspectives, or you do understand but not quite. It's more that when the microaggressions start to happen that folks talk about.
Well, let's talk about two different, I think you two are speaking about empathy in a different way, and I think I know what you're talking about because that's what I feel. Mm-hmm. When let's take this thing and talk about empathy for a moment.
Sure.
When you feel empathy towards someone, do you have an intervening step whereby you say, imagine if I were that person and that's what's causing me to feel empathy? Because I think what Brian's saying and what I experience is that I don't have that intervening step. Mm-hmm. I just kind of like feel it as if I were that person, but without having to engage in any kind of imaginative act of pretending to be that person.
Well, I don't think that's... I'm not necessarily talking about myself. I mean, I think I've been moved like that plenty of times. But I think that a lot of people haven't or don't, or there are situations where... I mean, how do you even make that leap? Is it because you're interacting with somebody right in front of you maybe and seeing some vulnerability? I think vulnerability moves us.
I think what happens is that empathy is like anything else, and different people have different abilities in it.
Sure.
Exactly.
And so when we're dealing with the person who's not empathetic, we end up resorting to saying to them, okay, you don't know what empathy is like, but I'm sure you know what self-interest is like. Now we're asking you to do this imaginative step where you imagine that you are this person. And we're already at a disadvantage. We're dealing with somebody for whom empathy doesn't come naturally to them. So the only way we can try to make them understand what we feel as empathetic people is asking them to pretend that their self-interest were being activated. Mm-hmm. What I'm saying is that for me, I don't have that barrier.
Yeah.
And it's and I feel it, not as if it were happening to me. I just feel it without.
Well, you wouldn't do the work you do otherwise. Neither would I. So absolutely. But I think like this, where I question empathy as something that we talk about needing to activate a lot. Well, how do we do it really for other people? Is thinking about racism, sexism. I mean, these pervasive, insidious. That are obviously layered, and we talk about implicit bias and all this. People aren't aware of it. But I wonder about empathy in those conversations. Like, it baffles me how folks can feel so removed from another person's experience. So I've lost a little bit of faith in that kind of in the act of empathy.
Yeah, I do think that while it is almost like something like addiction where you're predisposed to it, or any other ability, like something you're predisposed to, I think there can be a sort of like cognitive behavioral therapy sort of learning through that intermediary step that Sergio was talking about. I think it's required in order to get to that point where you can better immediately just like feel what that person's feeling, instead of say maybe there's a barrier before where someone says, I think these people, like, I think this criminal is bad. But once you are exposed to more and more, and you force yourself to think about it more and more, once you break down some of those barriers, which are basically assumptions, which are prejudices, then I think you're just opening the gateway to, like, just feel that thing. And I don't know. I mean, I'm starting to think, like, what kind of fears belie all of that stuff.
But the letter we read from earlier, right, is an individual telling us that he believes that because of art, right, that he can activate empathy.
Okay, you've sold me.
No, but doesn't he say? I hope people see now that prisoners are just like other people. What is he hoping they are reacting to?
Right.
They're hoping they're reacting to his art. And I don't even say that this two different forms of empathy, the one that needs to be activated and the one that comes natural to you. That I'm not saying that it's superior to have the one that comes natural to you. It's just like anything else. It's almost just like a trait you have. So my wife and I have it at this really high level, and we would do this thing where it's almost embarrassing to me. Like, if we met somebody, like for example, we'd be looking for an apartment. We'd go into someone's home to show us the apartment, and then we'd see what appear to be kind of really heartbreaking circumstances. Maybe it would be a single mother dealing with a child with disabilities and clearly not being able to handle things economically. We'd look at the apartment. We'd walk out such a wreck that we would literally engage in this activity. And I'm not even kidding. We would say to each other, well, obviously she has to move because she just won the lotto and she's going to buy this building and she's renting it. And we would create this entire invented narrative that would allow us, and we knew we were doing it and we were joking about it, but it would allow us to somehow be able to go on with our day. Because otherwise,
you'll be destroyed.
It's just crippling.
It's just like being like a radio that's always on and picking up every sound wave when you're flipping the stations and nothing's coming through.
Yeah.
Part of the great blessings of my life is to meet somebody else who's also that way, so that I don't have to kind of apologize for it. But it's that pronounced where we would laugh as we were doing it, but we'd be in the car walking out and we'd just be like, well, and we still do that to this day in similar circumstances. And I do the job that I do, and it becomes really difficult because in a sense you have to at some point create a professional distance in order to engage in certain professional activities that are going to try to help this person, rather than just kind of like break down and be like, why is the world so unfair that this person has to overcome these barriers? Well,
without that objectivity, it's hard to do your job.
Yeah.
And it's like hard to make the hard decisions.
When my clients, there are instances where our clients turn to us, by us I mean public defenders, and say, you're not the one going to jail. How come you're taking this so calm? I'm like, if you're going in for an operation, do you want the surgeon to come in and be like, look like he's just so stressed and so invested, or do you want a certain kind of
have to hold space,
clinical professional distance, because there are things that have to be done,
right?
That you have hopefully family and friends who can kind of just relate on that tragic level about the tragedy of your circumstances. I'm not sure that your lawyer should be reacting that way in order to accomplish certain things that need to be accomplished in a courtroom or in front of a jury.
And also, you can be deeply moved and disturbed, which I relate to everything you're saying on a very deep level as well. I'm very similar. But ultimately, you aren't the one going to jail. It's right. So if you break down, then there's also something that's a little
selfish.
Yeah, why are you doing that? Yeah. But I do think that that's why there's a name for secondary trauma, because it does affect people who work really close to difficult scenarios. And a book I recommend is Trauma Stewardship, which someone recommended to me when I was getting pretty destroyed by my work, and it was really affecting my health, everything. And it helped me put some things in perspective. And they have this great wheel, the author in the beginning of the book, that shows sort of different stages that people go through when they're experiencing secondary trauma. And I said, oh man, okay, I need to read this book. And it's things you already know, exactly what you're saying. You have to know how to create some distance. You have to understand your scenario is not that scenario. And you have to fill yourself up so then you can help somebody else. But it was very comforting for me. So if anybody's listening to this who struggles, it's a good book. It's worth it. It's tough, yeah. And I think there's a lot of people who work in these systems who experience it without even realizing it. And then what kind of pain does that distribute and cause around community, who don't have a name for it necessarily?
Well, yeah. A lack of awareness is probably one of the biggest reasons for a lot of the problems in our world. But so, I'm
To bring it all back, I mean, the
go
kind of campaign against mass incarceration can be viewed as just like a whole giant program trying to get people to engage in this act of empathy.
That's true.
And part of the ways we do it are just kind of like, hey, listen, this person got addicted to drugs. Are you addicted to like wine? Are you addicted? And you're trying to make the person understand how it is that the person behind bars is not a monster and is that.
Yep.
And it's we don't need to target this at the highly empathetic individuals. Those people already don't need that. They don't need that step. It's a certain kind of person who needs to understand how something like that could happen to them before they can activate any kind of energy towards changing.
I think that's what I struggle with that, that event you read at, which was, thank you, wonderful, and it was really exciting to put together. Who's in the room? How do you get it out of that room? And I guess that's where I lose some of losing faith. I don't know, I lose faith around humanity all the time. It's like a cyclical thing for me, and then I get hope again. And so, it's just something that I think about. I guess I used to have an answer that came really easily. Art creates empathy. That's its purpose. That's its use. It's great for that. And I've been challenged in that over the past few years of going, well, how well does it do it? And how do we get it outside of the room with the choir? But also I know this conversation about prison, particularly or mass incarceration. Even, I think we might have been talking about this on the last, I don't know if I'm repeating myself, last podcast. But even folks that are liberally minded, there's still a lot of gaps around this. And it's illustrated by the question I always get when I'm talking to people who I think would be automatically on board thinking about reform issues and alternatives to incarceration. Well, what about serial killers? Like, well, do you know how many people in prison are serial killers? Yeah. Very few. But also, honestly, it's something I don't know how to answer. I'm like, you know what, you're right. That's where I do get stuck. Because there are crimes and there are people who commit crimes. I was just watching, embarrassingly, maybe that American True Crime of the guy who killed Versace. You're watching this guy like, oh my God, what? How does somebody become that way? But I do think that at base level, these are some of the most unanswerable questions of being a human being. I don't know. How do you deal with that?
There are some indicators for serial killers.
Well, I do know that, antisocial personality and as a kid and all this, but I just wonder.
And like in the home life, there are some correlations like with relationships with the mother and stuff like that.
Sure, but what is the? I think that's where
it's fascinating.
Sometimes, as much as I'm on the forefront in many ways of having this political conversation around mass incarceration and it's wrong and we need to humanize people and this and that, there are places that I also get stuck with some of those really intense crimes and people who don't seem to show remorse.
Well, generally, though, when we're talking about, against mass incarceration, we're talking about the fact that in 1973 there were 250,000 people incarcerated, and today there's 2.5 million. So unless you think that the average human being took an incredible turn towards violating the laws and becoming serial killers, for example, or something like that, then you're going to have a hard time justifying it because all the statistics available will say that violent crime has dropped precipitously since 73. Right. And anecdotally, that seems right, too.
I guess I'm thinking about prison abolitionists when it's, abolish any form of that. So I guess I get curious about, what are we actually talking about on the whole? And not even with serial killers an extreme, but even with just, I know a lot of people who have committed really pretty intense crimes. And they have, people I know have really changed their lives, but each of those people, I was just writing about this in an essay, have told me, there are some people who belong in prison, though. Don't get too self-righteous there, Caits. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, you would know better than I. And so I think sometimes I struggle with, and you're right, mass incarceration is the political umbrella. We're looking at the whole picture, of course. But some of those questions stop me a little bit in knowing how to...
Those who defend mass incarceration have a vested interest in portraying the typical incarcerated person as violent when the statistics are clear.
Just like
that's not
they fall
the
into
case.
A category.
Right. The statistics are clear that that's not the case. It's not an either or, right? I don't think it's either abolish all prisons or incarcerate everyone. I mean, or keep the status quo. I mean, I think that I think a lot of reasonable people think 2.5 million seems like too much given the stats. I think but I mean, I get the problem. It's just a question of who's being allowed to shape the narrative, who's being allowed to label what the average person incarcerated looks like.
I also think there's an issue of, I don't know if criminal justice can ever truly be reformed. Well, I know you kind of said maybe, inferred at maybe never earlier, but until we know how much, like what level of free will we're working with. Because in order to rehabilitate people, we kind of do need to know what drives people to do certain things in certain circumstances. And if that's all it is, just drives and circumstances, then I think that changes the conversation a lot.
Well, we've gone a while. We haven't even mentioned racism, which is a big part of what allows people to not be empathetic and distance themselves.
Right.
Is this really kind of silly, noxious, invented thing that says, well, that person incarcerated doesn't look like me, so you're not activating that part of me that wonders how fair is the system, because I could never be part of it, because look what that person looks like, and look at what I look like, right? I mean, I think there's that John Rawls thing, which is like how would you want society to be if you were about to be born as one of the most vulnerable members of that society? Who the most vulnerable members of American society are in the 21st century is pretty easy to identify. Poor people, and in a lot of cases, people of color. So oftentimes you're arguing for change where power resides, and they are able to either consciously or unconsciously distance themselves from the people mostly affected because they don't look like them.
Oh, big time.
Sounds silly, but I think there's ample evidence that it's a thing.
No, I don't think it sounds silly at all. I think you're 100%. And I think because I'm in a room with people who have this conversation every day, skipping over things in our conversation as sort of the baseline, like we know this, so let's go into the harder question. And thank you for bringing it back, because of course, absolutely, it's all about race and class. Yeah.
I mean, I think somebody in one of my books says, if the average person being arrested looks like Tom Cruise, you don't think somebody would have done something by now? I'm not sure where I wrote that, but that's kind of the underlying point, which is that when we say, how is it that this can happen when we know there's this thing called empathy, the short answer is going to be that what it takes to activate empathy tends to be similarity.
I think that, absolutely. I think that's what I was getting. You have to bridge that
distance, right? So if the people to whom it's happening to are difficult for me to distinguish myself from, then empathy is activated more easily.
You could be one of them more easily.
That could be me.
Right.
We all do this, right? Something happens, you see somebody get in trouble, you say, do I do that also? Could I be the one getting in trouble? No, I never do that. Or you distance yourself.
Which I think those are the important questions we need to ask. They really, like,
right. Or we purposely engage in distancing behavior. Well, the person's a complete moron. He did X, Y, Z, which I would never do. Or something like that. Or whatever. It's just a natural human inclination immediately to want to distance yourself from somebody from whom something very negative has happened.
And feel immune.
Because we want to feel like that negative thing could not happen to us. So it's difficult. We say, go back to Trayvon Martin. Say, well, my son doesn't look like Trayvon Martin. This isn't. And then the people whose sons do look like Trayvon Martin are like, hold on, what the hell?
Right.
And then I'm not saying it's not a harsh dividing line. A lot of people who don't have sons who look like Trayvon Martin were also outraged.
Sure.
My point is, it's a lot easier to activate it if you're like, oh, wait a minute.
Yeah. So what bridges that too? What bridges that too? Because I mean, of course, it's all. I also think about just the history of our world, and that's colonialism in a nutshell. I see difference. It's wrong. I'm scared of it. I'm going to conquer it and exploit it.
And the fact that, I wonder how much what vestige is left over from just the sheer fact that people would come onto new land and then they would share diseases that the other weren't immune to. How much of a fear factor is residual from that? Probably not too much at this point, but I don't know. It's like there were these biological factors that weren't rooted in race. They were rooted in the fact that people were separate for so long on different continents and things like that. And I mean, how far can we be from that when we have not really evolved as a species? We've only just become far more connected. We're more available to each other. So it's like we're playing catch up, And I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I think like the continued exchange of information, especially through art. I don't think there's anything. I think I said this on the last podcast. I don't think there's anything we've created that teaches emotions like art, which is incredibly important because we suck at that. Emotions aren't rational. So I don't know. I just provided no answers.
No, it's okay. I
provided a very grim outlook.
I think I was thinking about this because this morning I read an article. I think it was in the Washington Post about Nicholas Cruz, the Parkland shooter, and his brother, who was a little younger than him. Their parents, they didn't know their parents. I think their mother gave them for adoption. Never knew their father. Raised, by another family. Then those parents died when they were teenagers. And I watched a video and read the article of his brother going in to visit him in prison and saying, like, who are you? This isn't you. And then the kid starts sobbing and he hugs his brother. And, I think that I think I'm bringing up where I get stuck in the conversation within myself, where, I can politically frame it, of course, and look at the larger picture of the system and why it's wrong. But sometimes when we get down to the individual level, I'm very challenged. And that really challenged me, watching and reading that this morning, because I did feel empathy for those kids. Mm-hmm. Even the one who had killed 17 students and destroyed many people's lives. And then I questioned that. So I think that some of these really deep-rooted questions of humanity and violence, particularly individual violence, and not so much systemic violence, which I feel much clearer on, I spin in that a little bit. I don't know. Mm-hmm. Maybe I'm revealing too much about my inner life over here.
I don't think you ever need to question anytime you feel empathy, which is a variant of love. Anytime you are increasing the world's collection of love, even at the lowest level, either through understanding somebody who's done something horrific or through just feeling in some sense that judging can be a difficult, fraught activity. I think those are positive developments. I don't think you can say, gee, I'm supposed to judge harshly this person and I didn't. What's wrong with me? It may be that we're not supposed to judge too harshly. It may be that no matter how awful the activity engaged in by an individual, by one of our fellow human beings, is that we're still under, the truth, whatever it is, might be that we're still under some kind of obligation to try to understand that, or try to muster, as difficult as it may be, some semblance of empathetic love or just kind of forgiveness, and that's what you're reacting to.
Thank you for saying that. It's helpful. It's helpful. And in this call-out culture we live in, is something I struggle with too. There's a lot of let's condemn, let's throw them in jail. Example. And that doesn't resonate with me, but it's tough to talk about.
But you can still hate the thing the person did.
Sure.
You can still hate that this describes the world we live in. You can still hate that this is a feature of the world we live in, but it's rarely productive to just say about another human being, throw them away, and they're not entitled to any kind of consideration.
Which is really what our culture does. It does on every level too, is what I noticed.
The reason I was so happy you brought that letter with you is because I think that that's what people who are incarcerated feel. They feel that as if everybody who's not in here has essentially thrown us away and said we're not worthy of kind of human dignity.
Yeah.
And those who would battle against people like me who are activists in favor, or yourself, an activist in favor of criminal justice reform, will always have at their ready, well, so you're in favor of this guy? He chopped up his whole family and made them into tomato soup.
Right.
Well,
and it's a rhetorically powerful device. That's why it's been in effect forever and will continue to be in effect, because it's a rhetorically powerful device.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean they're right and you're wrong. It just happens to be a really powerful device.
Mm-hmm.
Sergio, that's so helpful for me. Thank you. It really is. Rhetorical device, too. Great phrase to think about it.
And also,
listen, it's a rhetorical device that many think decided an election in 1988.
Right.
First, right? I guess, this is very famous. I don't have to delineate it. While he was governor, the Democratic candidate had to approve some kind of prison furlough program. And the Republicans said, here's that prison furlough program, Willie Horton.
Right. Of course, right. The famous one.
It's a powerful device because we're repulsed by the act.
Yep.
And that repulsion leads to judging harshly, but also you want revenge.
Yeah.
You're hurt in some sense. Some conception of your humanity has been injured, and your response whenever a human being is injured, their first one of the early responses is, I want to injure back. I want to hurt. However, whatever form that takes, and I may not even understand that that's literally what's happening, but it's happening somewhere in there. We'll be right back after these messages.
Yeah, really. Thank you. Now, there's a lot of framework then. I think I needed to hear that from somebody else. So often I feel like I'm the one saying these things, so it's affirming for me to hear.
We all need to be validated
that in your extremely articulate way. So thank you.
I'll let you guys into some inside baseball. We represent some people who've done some pretty crazy things, right?
Yeah. I assume
come back
so.
And be like, you got that case? Oh, that's awful. The guy's a sweetheart. We said, no, I love that guy.
No,
and another guy, I can't stand that guy. He didn't do anything that bad. The truth is, it's very easy to hate and judge at a distance. But when you're sitting across from someone gets really difficult, you'll find.
Sure does.
It gets really difficult when you're having a conversation with someone to then, maintain that monster narrative. And so what you're reacting to is, oh, there's that monster who did that. I don't have to expend any thought on him. I don't have to expend any empathy. I don't have to do anything with regard to him. He's
That's what
safely
judgment does.
classified as a monster. Shit, here's this interview with him, or whatever it is. Here's this story, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, really? That happened to him when he was in second grade? That sucks. You're making it so I can't just
not your fire truck.
And sometimes it builds up, and sometimes it doesn't. But people have been put to death by our criminal justice system who you can kind of go back to some of the things that happened to them at an early age or even later on, and you could build up pretty easily some pretty strong empathy for the people who've been executed for the acts that they committed. I hate to be referring to things I wrote, but I don't even know where I wrote it, but at some point somebody visits somebody on death row, and they have a reaction similar to what you're describing, but then the CEO says, oh, here's pictures of what the person did. Now you'll see. And once you review this, once you see the pictures of what he did, it will decomplicate what just happened. The interaction you just had with him, where you saw him as a human being, where you felt all these awful emotions of empathy and caring about this person. I can help you with that. Here's a picture of what he did. And there's a truth to that, which is, they can always snap you back into, and this is what he did. Now what do you think of him? It's complicated. Life turns out to be really complicated.
Sure
Moral
is.
judgments turn out to be really fraught with all sorts of, difficulties. That's cool.
Yeah.
That's
right.
Was that any of your motivation to write A Naked Singularity, to investigate that? Or because it's like a lot of it's just a heist book, But there's there's that guy on death row. It's been like 6 years since I read the book or something.
I think a lot about that novel was myself interrogating these things to myself about some of the things you've pointed out, some of the weird reactions we have to other human beings are centered around moral decisions and acts of violence and etc. So it's a large part of what back to the compulsion, what causes the compulsion for me to write. A large part of it is a motivation to understand. Not necessarily understand myself, which I don't particularly think I'm a highly interesting topic even for myself, but understand everything, existence, our lives, the way we interact with each other, what society is, etc. A lot of my motivation's too weak a word. I would call it a compulsion. To write in this manner is an attempt for myself to figure these things out, to at least at a minimum strive towards a deeper understanding than is possible when you're distracted by everything that comes at you in everyday life.
I relate to that for sure.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of something right now. There's someone who's talking about the difference between their operational terms were different, but like a literary mindset and that daily mindset, and they are so different. And I am not good at the daily mindset. That's why I like writing. It's like I like sitting there and just thinking things through, because when those things start flying at you, I just feel like I'm not at the pith of existence. And maybe that's a solipsistic feeling. I don't know. But when I write, it is really trying to just figure out what's going on and trying to control it in some small way.
Sure.
Because we don't have much control.
The pop culture myth is like inspiration hits you and you have to drop everything and create.
And you write it in 3 nights.
And that does happen sometimes. I'm not going to say it never happens.
It's actually wonderful when it happens, but it's so rare.
Well, the only time Bret Easton Ellis did meth for 3 weeks and wrote a novel once, but I don't know if I'd recommend that.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful when it happens if you can immediately feed it.
True. True.
But more often, what happens is, and I think what you're getting at is that you have to enter a certain kind of headspace or view, receptive. You have to be really receptive kind of view before the art creating will happen. So when I'm frustrated, when people often say to me, how did you write while doing all that work? Sometimes you're not necessarily sure it's going to result in anything that looks like a novel or looks like fiction or looks like art or whatever. But you do need to create the openness to it first before you can experience it and have it actually emerge into something.
I had a professor at Sarah Lawrence Garth Risk Hallberg, I'm sure. Yeah, Sergio, did he interview
I know
you?
him. I know him.
Yeah. He always said that he likes to write after he's had a change of consciousness. And I think that allows you to get into that receptive mind space, because once you have kind of like an abrupt shift, I feel like you're more readily unhinged from those sort of obsessions and compulsions that drive you every day. Those grooves. You come out of those grooves and you kind of can see things a little more broadly. Yeah, he used to wake up and just, I don't know if he still does this, but he woke up at like 4:30, the ass crack of dawn, and just wrote when he was
So envious of
half drunk on sleep, I don't know how he did that.
Well, for me, the problem is I need experience, because experience is what I'm going to transmute into the work. But then I also need to create the conditions for this openness. In a lot of ways can be defined as not experiencing something.
Right.
So there's that tension between, you need to be, I think that the best work comes from experience, comes from living out in the world, and then transmuting that into art, which is why I'm not very often tempted by the idea of being a full-time writer who wakes up every day and just stares at the walls till something's not particularly appealing to me for a variety of reasons.
Me either.
But one of them being that I think that could get, as you're referring to, a little bit of that solipsism of like navel-gazing type stuff that I definitely am not down with or in favor of. I'm willing to discuss anything. I know
What
Caits
about
is very adamant that we discussed this cheese platter, but
yeah, let's talk about that. I think
I'm feeling a little ill, actually. Gave me too much permission.
do you need medical attention?
Yes.
what's better, this
might be my addiction,
this
actually.
Borskin cheese or Steph Curry's 3-point shot?
I mean, I don't watch basketball, but
But this
do
is
think
where
Steph Curry's
empathy-
pretty impressive.
Yeah.
That's one name I know.
Yeah, he's
There you go.
become more than a basketball player, shall we say? Or
I think
is
so.
it
I mean,
something
he-
that I think most
he-
people know.
he
I'm
joked
teaching a
about-
class,
he-
and
he-
a co-teacher showed him as like, we were doing a class on like reaching towards the impossible, which sounds really cheesy, but it was actually really cool the way we framed it. It was a long time ago, and I really remember that deeply. It was for high school students, and that was one of the videos we showed. And I got into it. I'm not saying I'm not into basketball. I've just never been put on. I wasn't
That's
in a
the
sports
thing.
family, but I would love to go to a game. I think it's very exciting when you're in it.
It's all about just
Sorry,
learning,
Yeah. But also a toss-up. That cheese is pretty good.
That was like an empathy exam right there.
The mayor's got it's being used as a decent shorthand here in New York City to encompass a lot of criminal justice reforms issues that were active. I guess I should have said at some point I'm the legal director of a place called New York County Defender Services. It's a public defender office in Manhattan. So I do a lot of work centered around legal reform with respect to New York City and the way its criminal justice system operates. So one of the things the mayor has declared as a goal is the closing of Rikers Island. I think most people know what Rikers Island is. Have
Yeah.
you been, Caits?
Yeah, I used to teach there. I've been there many times.
What would that alleviate?
Well, also you got to talk about what the plan looks like, because I'd be
Yeah.
curious about your thoughts about
I know nothing about this.
the
The
community.
plan is to keep incarcerating people,
Well,
but to
just
increase them
moving
in sufficiently fewer numbers that you can move them to more humane facilities that
So-
aren't as toxic.
the community jails, right? That they're talking about opening.
So the idea being before you could do that, you would have to drastically reduce the number of incarcerated New Yorkers.
Mm-hmm.
So to do that, you would have to encompass all these other reforms like bail reform, discovery reform. So a good way to view it is to say, hey, the mayor announces as a goal, we want to close Rikers Island. Okay, in order to do that, you would have to do X, Y, Z. And so that leads to other criminal justice reforms that we're active in pushing for.
Oh, so it's funny. We were just talking about basketball. There's like a little celebrity coalition going on. I don't know if you've heard about it. It's like
Jay-Z,
like
Meek Mill.
Jay-Z, Meek Mill, Robert Kraft, I think, for the Patriots owner. The dude who owns the 76ers.
I don't know the sports people.
Have you
I
heard
just know
about
the
this, Sergio?
celebrities.
Yes, and there's also
Is
the
it legit? Is
the-
this like,
NFL
Oh, it's like
has
2
them
weeks
too.
old, but it seems legit. And,
is? Okay.
And there's also the NFL Players Union, which is, taking a pretty laudable role in advocating for criminal justice reform. I guess probably as an offshoot of the whole Colin Kaepernick.
I think
et cetera.
totally.
Yeah, I think
it was
definitely
totally
think
that.
so. I mean, Jay-Z has been a huge advocate of Colin Kaepernick and his deal. So
And we, New York County, meaning New York County Defender Services, we've partnered with the NFL Players Union on certain issues, and I believe we're going to be meeting with this new coalition that you're referring to also. Yeah, this is part of what I think we started, or close to the start. I said, as a big change in society in the sense of being aware of these issues and being motivated that simply wasn't there 6-7 years ago at all. So that's heartening, and that's great, and that's the kind of activation of empathy, maybe of a social empathy.
Sure.
That I think is an example of what can happen if you beat the drum long enough. And
That was a video that activated me around these issues when I was 14.
Okay.
I saw the Books Through Bars, Books Not Bars, sorry, Books Through Bars is an organization, video out of the Ella Baker Center that I think you can still find on YouTube, and it was about youth incarceration. And it, sadly, many of the stats haven't changed at all from the film. I watched it fairly recent, a couple of years ago again, and it totally, I mean, it moved me deeply. I couldn't believe what was happening, and I would have had no idea unless I'd seen this video that somebody showed in a youth group I was in.
yes, I mean, stuff
Right.
can work, you
Yeah.
know. I mean, I think that the criminal justice activist work is an example of that, where it has worked. I think Michelle Alexander's book, maybe 2012, has been, a real good catalyst. And she's not alone. I mean, there's other people have been beating this drum for a long time, but I think it finally feels like society is recognizing that the status quo can't continue. And that's heartening. I'm generally an impatient person, and it just makes me want to see, even more progress made. But when I'm being reasonable, I view it as a positive development.
Has it sustained since Trump's gotten into office, the momentum?
Yeah, I mean, mass incarceration is generally not a federal phenomena.
Yeah.
I say generally. I mean, the federal system contributes to it, don't get me wrong. But it's generally, I would say the last 2 years have not seen any diminution. If anything, the progress has continued. One of the few bright spots probably in the last 2 years.
That's surprising, actually.
And two wins that I was excited about from the last election was the voter disenfranchisement in Florida being overturned, people with felony convictions being able to vote, although nonviolent. I would love to see everybody who had a felony conviction able to vote. And also in Louisiana, the 1012 law being overturned, where non-unanimous juries were convicting people, and it was Jim Crow era mainstay, and often manipulated in very racist ways.
I didn't hear about that, actually.
Yeah, I was able to spend some time through a conference, Arts for Justice conference actually, with a guy named Norris Henderson, who spent many years at Angola prison and was very instrumental in changing the culture there from the inside. And now that he's out, he has an organization called VOTE, Voices of the Experienced, and he works actually very closely with prison administration, as he says he kind of has a key to the place. So we got to see a lot of, I think, stuff most people don't get to see when they go there, including death row, which was very intense, obviously. And he's just incredible. I just urge everybody to look him up, because it's like he's just a major civil rights leader of our time, but largely unknown, obviously, outside of this small sphere. And he was really instrumental in pushing that forward and really getting the voter turnout for it. And we were there right on the heels of that, like maybe 2 weeks or less after, so it was very fresh. So a lot of folks in prison were talking to us about that as well. So those things, they give me hope, but I think a lot has to be undone, and I don't think I'm going to see what I would like to see in my lifetime. But it is heartening to see.
I mean,
changing.
I want immortality, so I'm prepared to be let down.
I think there's been progress in terms of the society's, the spirit of the age with respect to these issues, but the truth is, in New York, I get a skewed view because we have really highly effective, well-funded, or at least, I shouldn't say well-funded because I'll always take more, but funded,
better funded
public defender offices. But throughout the country, you see just a pronounced lack of will towards properly funding the right to counsel and indigent defense offices throughout the country. It's a crisis.
Yeah.
And so while I'm glad that society is, deciding that the status quo is unacceptable when it comes to criminal justice reform, there's a lot that needs to be done before you could say that we have a fair criminal justice system.
Oh,
that
tremendous.
lives up to the ideals. Because now I'm taking a national view. I'm not talking about my work in New York City or dealing with that administration. I'm talking nationally, there's just huge gaps and tremendous injustice flourishing everywhere. So that in that sense, what you say about never being satisfied in your lifetime, I certainly don't expect to be satisfied in my lifetime with the way we organize our society around criminal justice issues. But I was trying to strike an optimistic note as per the producer's request.
Oh, sorry, I brought us down into the ditch
brought
again.
Us down again. Now we
If we
Well,
can't
let me ask
satisfy
this.
ourselves, we
Listen,
will
well,
satisfy
but
our producers.
you know what? I think the bright spots in the conversation always come from individual stories and from the humanity that prevails despite. I mean, for me anyway, that's what keeps me able to be in this world. But I don't feel many bright spots in criminal justice on the whole, and that's just true. It's hard to spin that, but
It's a dark area. You know,
Of
it's like you have
course.
people that are put in unfortunate scenarios and commit unfortunate acts, and then we have to figure out a way to get the whole thing to work better. And honestly, like, you know, the rehabilitation element is what we're fighting for, right? And so that I think we're just so far from focusing on that rather than the punishment.
well, also the systems are just so deeply rooted and deeply connected to past historical atrocities. I mean, it's like you have to upend our whole society, really, is to
Yeah.
get criminal justice to be something that's not
Yeah,
so
you have to reverse
far.
engineer something that's been in place for a very long
So
time.
it's sort of daunting,
Yeah.
right? I mean, of
Yeah.
course it happens in steps, but unless you want total anarchy, which also is terrifying to think about. But on the conversation of, or the question of what can people do to get involved, I'm actually curious to ask Sergio, because people ask me this all the time, and I actually don't ever quite know what to say, because I happen to have volunteered in this field for a long time, did a lot of teaching, although it's not necessarily easy to teach in prisons, especially around New York City. They're very saturated with volunteers, kind of blessedly. In other places in the country, they're definitely not. And for my particular work with writers, you know, we can't even handle the amount of people that want to work with us. So I'm curious. So what do you say to people who ask you that? I'd like to have a better answer.
Again, you know, New York City has a ton of great organizations like the Vera Institute or Vocal New York. A lot of them came up, and you mentioned earlier the meeting that we had with the second time you and I met, or where you know, there are a lot of great organizations doing really powerful work. I think in the, you know, nowadays, if you happen to be in one of these communities that I'm referring to that maybe doesn't have a public defender office, where they rely on civil attorneys to kind of get assigned cases and stuff, start a political movement to say that, you know, your public defender's offices have to be properly funded. Because to me, the primary methodology by which true reform is going to happen is through the attorney of the accused. And maybe I'm biased because that's what I've been doing for 20 years, but I feel like if you properly fund public defender offices and you make it so that the average public defender doesn't have 300 clients but has 40, if you can do that, if you can accomplish that, which is what a lot of my work has been to try to accomplish that in New York City, if you can accomplish that, then I think you'll see a lot of the abuses being addressed, and then you'll see more of the higher level activism taking place. But first, it's an emergency situation. It's people not receiving the proper, you know, their constitutional right to an attorney is being violated every day.
Yeah, I was going to
throughout this
ask
country.
whether the language was at all ambiguous on that.
There's a big article about that this week.
Because
too,
if
that
you,
came out. Came away.
you know, what's the difference between a public defender and what was it, a civil attorney? You said.
Well, it's when I
Like
say
what-
civil, I mean attorneys who are kind of allow their names to be put on a list to be assigned the criminal case, where the criminal defense may not be their primary focus, may not be their
Because they do
area
civil-
of
they do
expertise.
civil stuff,
And
yeah.
even if it were their area of expertise, they're one individual not functioning outside of an office with the resources, with the investigators, social workers, administrative
Right.
staff that helps us do our job at the highest level. So throughout the country, you see either really poorly funded public defender offices, or this even worse system being used, and it's to the detriment of mostly indigent people of color whose
Right.
rights are being violated. So I would say that the new activism or the activism that we've identified to evolve into a more effect has to center around this issue of properly funding public defenders and properly meeting the constitutional right to counsel for accused, because that's the only methodology by which we can get widespread national change.
Yeah, the parallels between that and education are scary.
Oh, for
I mean,
sure.
just the lack of funding in both of those areas. Is, the public sphere just feels like it's really dropping the ball.
And there's also
That's not a positive.
There's
Positive,
also
guys.
a couple organizations, probably more than a couple, but a movement around prosecutors as well, and really looking at changing the way that prosecutors are doing their work. Can you
Prosecutors
speak
have
to
a
that?
lot of power, and that's why I think the indigent defense bar is a check against that power.
Yeah.
And that's why I think the next evolutionary step in this whole, movement against mass incarceration has to center around the public defender. I'm fortunate every day to go to an office and be surrounded by public defenders, the people who've basically devoted their careers to, battling on behalf of the forgotten, the lost, and not for money, not for prestige, because nobody says, "Ooh, that's impressive that you're a public defender." So I'm one of my joys in life is just every day being surrounded by these people. We have a common goal, we have a common mindset about what this all means, and so it's great and it's exciting. But I just would love to see society recognize a special role of these people, and how if you don't give them the resources, you're not truly creating a fair, equal system.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's how I would caution people to get involved, either through political activism towards making sure that where you are, the public defender office is being properly supported, or directly volunteering at a public defender office in some of these jurisdictions that could really use.
So if I wanted to do that, what would I do? Would I just be like filing? Would I be doing anything? What can I do?
I mean, I guess it would depend on what you could do.
What skills I have. Yeah.
Right, but I think that, as I said, a lot of these public defender entities, whether there's government offices or not, are under siege. They cannot deal with the volume. They need manpower, right? And so part of that is lobbying for more money, because money allows you to hire lawyers, allows you to hire investigators, social workers.
Is it also somewhat of a problem of incentive, like payment, like salary wise? Are there not enough public defenders because of that, or is it more just an issue of we don't have the resources to hold that many public defenders in this office?
I think a lot of leaders of public defender offices have basically said, to comply with the ABA standards or to meaningfully represent all the clients that you're giving me, I would need 20 more lawyers. To get 20 lawyers, I would have to hire them. I would have to pay them. I don't have the money to pay them.
Right.
So it's really not that complicated. It literally is, society that jurisdiction not prizing what public defenders do enough to pay.
Convincing people to defend criminals, I guess, is in the public's eyes.
There's no shortage of talented people who are willing to do this work, but you still have to get paid. You have to live. Mm-hmm. You have to be hired to do it. I don't think that there's any shortage, especially nowadays. I don't think there's any shortage of attorneys who would gladly sign up to do this really critical, important, really intellectually thrilling work. There's just a failure to properly fund these offices in many places.
And I think as we talk today, as far as I know, MDC in Brooklyn was without heat. So there's been a lot of calls for protesting that, getting that heat back on. Obviously, it's been freezing in New York in the last few days. Getting extra blankets, people aren't getting access to commissary to even buy an extra sweatshirt or seeing their family. So often it's also very urgent too. So as we're sitting here talking about it with a cheese platter, there are folks just right across the river suffering right now.
Yep. You guys want to?
Sorry, that we were supposed to end on a positive note. We really didn't do a great job.
All right, I'll do a closer.
Okay, that's it for today's episode. If you like what you heard, please subscribe and review on whichever platform you're listening. You can get in touch with us on Twitter at Animal Riot Press or Facebook and Instagram at the same name, or through our website, animalriotpress.com. This has been the 8th episode of the Animal Riot Podcast with your host, Brian Birnbaum, and featuring Sergio De La Pava and Caits Meissner. Transcripts for our deaf and hard of hearing animals are provided by Jonathan Kay, and we are produced by me, Katie Rainey. See you later, you filthy animals.
Sir, it's the burn. Bombing on y'all and getting gully as the fern. I don't know much about Lee.